I'm sorry, I realize I've been talking with my mic off. Katie, I was wondering if you can confirm that we have a quorum. I count a quorum, but I just wanted to check and see if we do.
Yeah, why don't I go ahead and go through and do a verbal roll call.
Okay.
Welcome everyone. I hope y'all's day is going well. I will start with Kimberly Kirby, and folks can just say here or here.
Here.
Thank you. Leslie Chambers. Okay, I see Leslie.
I see her. I know she's on her phone, so she may be driving. And
Okay. Catherine is here. Next is Lieutenant Kyle Hanna.
Here.
Okay. Ramona Harris.
Here.
Thank you. Francis Abbott.
Here.
Thank you. Shannon Derman.
Here.
Okay. Sunny Funk.
I'm here.
Thank you. Kristen Raby.
Here.
Thank you. Rutha Chatwood. Okay. I see Rutha's square. Ashley Severson.
She's actually not here today. I'll be attending in her place from Star.
Oh, great. And Diana Wynn, that's correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Rachel Mayu.
Here.
Thanks, Rachel. Mariah Wineski.
Here.
Thank you. Sandra Starr. Okay, we'll come back for Sandra. I am here. Dolphinette Martin.
Here.
Hi, Dolphinette. Tiffany Simpson.
I'm here.
Thank you. Remy Starnes. Okay, and Scott Payton.
I'm here.
Yes, Catherine, we have a quorum.
wonderful. Thank you, Katie. So since we have a quorum, and it looks like a lot more too, that's great. This meeting's called to order. And I wanted to say hello to everyone. I'm sorry we had to miss last month's meeting, but of course, the weather had something else in mind for us. I hope everyone is recovering from Hurricane Ida and didn't suffer too much distress or damage. But so we have to make up from having missed a month. The last time, the first thing I guess we probably ought to do is just confirm that everyone had a chance to look at the minutes that Katie shared with the group through email from the August meeting. And I guess technically, should we move to adopt those minutes? If we're going to have a formal rules. So I would make.
I'll make a motion.
Thank you. We have a motion to adopt the minutes. Do I have a second? Anyone?
Yeah, I'll second it. Scott Payton.
Great, thank you. Motion made, seconded by Scott Payton. The minutes from the August meeting have been adopted. At that last meeting, we had talked about how it would be very useful for us to understand the scope and nature of the problem of incarcerated survivors in broadly, and of course in Louisiana, and also specifically in the Department of Corrections. And at the last meeting, we had decided to extend an invitation to have some speakers come to talk with us about those issues and help us understand those issues more fully. And so we invited Dr. Marcus Konkar and the Assistant Secretary in Department of Corrections, Rhett Covington, and also have with him the Director of Mental Health with the Department of Corrections, Blake LeBlanc, to talk to us today about those issues. I see Mr. Covington and Mr. LeBlanc with us. I'm not seeing if we have Dr. Konkar. I don't know if he has joined us yet. Marcus or Dr. Konkar, are you here? If you are, make yourself known. No. Well, okay, given,
I'm
Yeah,
reaching
sorry.
out to him now.
okay, thank you, Francis. So, well, although I think Dr. Konkar was going to was going to be talking about the issues very broadly and sort of giving us a national and statewide sort of broad survey. Since he isn't with us just yet, why don't I introduce Assistant Secretary Covington and Director LeBlanc to perhaps sort of talk about, more of a dive in here with the DOC, if that makes sense, so that we can move forward. So yes,
We can do that.
great, thank you. Thank you for, doing things a little out of order, but sounds good.
That's fine. So I guess I'll start just kind of give you the some of the parameters that we have to work within in the department and some of the challenges that we face. So in general, when we put programs in place anywhere in our system, we are limited by the resources that we have and by the placement of the person who is incarcerated. So in Louisiana, in the late 90s, in the early 90s, excuse me, we decided that we would not build new prisons. We would just work with the sheriffs, and they would be the folks that would house our population. As a result, about half our population is in local jails, even to this day. That creates a tremendous pressure on us to be able to deploy programs to everyone evenly throughout the whole state, because of those disparate locations where there may be as few as one or two, as many as several hundred in one location. So that creates a problem with reaching the population. It also means that when a person is sentenced, they go many times straight to those local jails. They don't come to a reception center. We have certain parameters on what we can take as far as the volume to come in. So if they have certain offenses, certain history of medical mental health issues that are already known by the jail where they were housed prior to sentencing, if they are a high profile person or someone that we believe we're going to need to bring into the state prison system because of security issues, escapes, et cetera, then we will bring them into the reception diagnostic center. And that's where they're going to get the stuff that Ms. LeBlanc is going to talk about when it comes to the screening and so forth. For our female population, for our ladies, they generally fall into three buckets. And there's about 1,200 or so women in the state, which makes up about 6.5% of our population. And it's great that we're talking about them because I think there is a huge trauma need there, although there is a very large need for trauma-related services for the men as well. This is a great starting point for us, though. I think that they fall either into going to LCIW, or they go to the Transition Center for Women in the Northeast part of the state, or there's a few that are sprinkled out in other local jails that have not been able to make it to one of those two places yet. So that gives us a much more centralized or concentrated attempt to be able to connect to those ladies who are incarcerated. So I'm going to next move to our focus on how we do programs. So there's education programs, there's skill training programs, there's didactic educational programs that we do, and we have what we call certified treatment and rehabilitative programs. And that's just a broad group of programs that if a person takes those, they're awarded credits towards early release if they can earn credits towards early release. We call those, for short, because we're the state, we have to make acronyms for everything. We call those CTRP programs. So if I refer to that, that's just because that's in my head how I think about things. So there are some CTRP programs that do relate to trauma, either directly or indirectly. One is Beyond Trauma, which is offered at LTCW for the ladies. And the other one is Helping Women Recover, which is a substance use treatment program, but it focuses heavily on trauma because one of the largest indicators, at least to my knowledge, as a lay person in this type of treatment, Ms. LeBlanc can correct me if I'm wrong, but trauma is a huge factor as to why women use and become addicted to begin with. So We have those two programs, but one of the concerns that we have anytime we start dealing with trauma-related services and dealing with trauma is having the proper personnel who've been trained to deal with it, focus on it, and if possible, not do it in a group setting. And I'll let Ms. Blunt talk a little bit about how we focus on that. So if we see somebody who starts getting triggered or has issues related to participation in those programs at LTCW, we will look to move them into LCIW if we can do that. Now, this may seem like a great picture, like we've already handled everything, but there's a lot missing to that whole thing. And we do agree that there needs to be more resources put at this. We're in the same boat as the community is, in that there's insufficient resources to treat trauma to meet the need. And if there was enough resources in the community, we likely wouldn't have these ladies with us incarcerated to begin with. So we have the same challenges that our community has at large with insufficient resources. So having said all of that, I mean, I may think about some stuff a little bit more, but I'd rather turn it over to you, Blake,
Sure.
just to kind of talk about what we do when a person comes into reception diagnostic and where they go from there.
Well, I'll start back at the parish level. At the parish level, if one of the parishes identifies anybody who's having some mental health issues, there's a process to refer that patient to me. There's also a process for judges to refer a patient into us. And so every week I'm moving people for mental health issues. I'm moving people for substance use issues, sex offender treatment. As every week I'm handling transfers and moving people to appropriate programming. But when they do come into our reception centers, and we have two, one's at Elaine Hunt Correctional and the other's at Raymond LaBorde Correctional Center. When they do come in through our reception centers, we first do an initial screening the first day they show up. And that screening is more geared towards, do you look dangerous to yourself or others? Are you psychotic right now? We catch a little bit of background, and that helps us to determine that day, is this patient safe? Are they good to go in a cell or a dorm or whatever we need to do? And then within 14 days, we're going to come back and we're going to do a full-on mental health appraisal. And that appraisal, for any of you in mental health, it looks a lot like a psychosocial. It looks at certain domains of their life: education, substance use, mental health history, medical history, social history, work history. We're taking a lot of history about that person. And you sort of, it's a broad question that you start with, and based on the answer that the client gives you, you may dig deeper into that. And so we do get at trauma some in that document. Unfortunately, that document is a paper document right now because we've not moved into the electronic healthcare system fully. We have one that medical is moving into, but we've had some challenges with mental health because medical electronic healthcare records are not set up for case management as we do in mental health. And we needed a lot more quality assurance. So we're continuing with our old program right now, which has those. It's sort of like an electronic healthcare record that we use, but it's not fully integrated with medical. But our notes are on computer and it works for us right now. But we're going to full on go into the electronic healthcare record. And when that happens, the diagnoses are going to be captured electronically. And when we capture diagnosis electronically, that's when we can provide a lot better data, because I know one of the pushes I've been getting was to provide some data on how many we have identified with these particular types of disorders. And so unfortunately, I don't have that data electronically right now. It exists on papers in every prison in the state. So in the future, we'll be moving on to that. So right now, when we do identify somebody who has any kind of trauma, PTSD issues, what we would do is refer into our psychiatrist. And we'd also set them up on a caseload with a social worker or a professional counselor. But their counselor / social worker will see them on a prescribed schedule based on the level of care we assign to them. We have level of cares 1, which would mean like you're in a psychiatric hospital, all the way to 5, which means you have no mental health issues at all. And based on your level of care, there's a prescribed reoccurrence at which we will see you. So we put them on a caseload. We have them see the psychiatrist. If as they're indicated, they're going to get medications. And we do the majority of that counseling individually. And like Red had alluded to, we don't like to delve too deep into trauma in a prison setting in a group, because sometimes inmates take information out of that group. Sometimes if you trigger something and they go back, they may start cutting themselves. But the secretary just sent me a group, something the other day about exploring trauma. And I really like this group because what the group does is it sort of starts at identifying what triggers your PTSD, what that feels like in your body, and learning some techniques to sort of shut that down. So we're not exactly dealing with the initial trauma event in groups. We're not disclosing a lot, but we are teaching them some self-soothing techniques to better control themselves. We're identifying triggers, talking about how we're going to handle triggers in the future when we meet them, prepping their mind for that. So I like that group, and I think we're going to end up incorporating that group. But the majority of what we've done, the majority of treatment has been individual between counseling and psychiatry. And that's been pretty much our addressing of trauma so far. And Rhett's right in that resources is an issue. We would like to do more. We would like to have a better trauma screening. I'd love to have more social workers. A lot of what we end up doing in prisons, we end up, you work in cell blocks because that's where most of the suicides happen. So we spend a lot of time in cell blocks. We spend a lot of time tracking the seriously mentally ill. We get involved in institutional courts at times to try and keep the SMI out of cell blocks whenever we can. We do a lot of different roles. We do things in discharge. We help with getting them set up for Medicaid. Psychiatric call-outs we're sitting in on. We do the individuals, we do the groups. So we sort of have our set of duties, and every maybe 3 or 4 years, we get additional duties, either through some mandate given to us or our own accreditation body adds additional duties. I'll give you an example. Right now, one of the big pushes is restricted housing. And so how we're handling restricted housing, and they want more touches in restricted housing. So within 7 days of somebody being in restricted housing, mental health's not going to see that patient. And then every 30 thereafter, if they're identified as a mental health patient, we're going to see them. And so that's an example of adding some additional things to us, but it's a reason why we're doing that. It's because most of the suicides are going to happen in cell blocks. So that said, we do want to do more, and I think we're going to incorporate exploring trauma, and we're going to end up in electronic healthcare record. And so that's going to benefit us a good bit. And so at that point, I'll stop to let everybody catch up to questions if you have any.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I certainly know that I have a bunch of questions, and maybe while it's fresh, if we can, I see Dr. Konkar's here, but maybe if we can hold off 1 second and just with sort of limited time, ask a couple of questions. And I don't know if the group has any. I certainly know I had a number of questions. So one of them, Mr. Covington, if you could maybe explain or answer this, can the DOC offer any programming to those people who are in sheriff's custody?
Yes, if we have the resources, and we do. The Transition Center for Women is a prime example of that. That's the regional reentry center that we made specifically for women back in 2010. We've had a contract with the Madison Parish Sheriff's Office since 2010, and we house 500 to 600 women there, which is almost half of our population of ladies at that center, and have for 10, 11 years now. And that's why I was saying we have those trauma-related programs that are the CTRP programs, because we don't have the same mental health staff at that location that we do at LCIW. So the more acute, the more serious.
That's
patients.
right. The more acute patients are always going to end up in the facilities. Now we do have, like you said, we have LTCW. We also have like SHIZAP, which is a substance abuse treatment center. We have more substance abuse treatment in the parishes than we do mental health. And we also have the transition centers, right? And so we have footprints in the parishes, but I wouldn't say they have a lot of acute mental health. That capacity where you're going to need psychiatrists and social workers, that's not a very heavy presence. That usually moves in. We generally treat substance abuse more in the parishes.
Okay. And then I assume that that's a resource problem, right?
It's an expense problem. Yeah, I have a psychiatrist and social workers in very rural areas. is not an easy thing to find, number one. For example, in Madison Parish,
We struggled for years.
you drive an hour and you're in Monroe, and I lived there for 14 years. That's not a metropolitan area. So in these rural areas, what you find with mental health services is that they end up working in psychiatric hospitals and intensive outpatient programs because that's very lucrative. So doing things on an outpatient basis for a psychiatrist in a rural area it's not very lucrative. So you don't find a lot of outpatient clinics spring up.
Yeah, so I would just say that creates problems for us in staffing. And so it's not necessarily just the number of positions we have, but it's the amount of money that we're allowed to pay. And it's just the location of most of our prisons. I mean, LCIW, if it were a facility again, because it flooded and we're kind of pillar to post right now with the ladies until we can get it rebuilt. It's in an area that we might be able to draw some staff down, and we have some, but getting some out into your local jails is going to be very difficult. And so that's why we put our less acute, more stable folks out there.
I would say this though, one of the nice things COVID's taught us, it's actually forced people into the electronic world even more so than they've ever been before. I know some older psychiatrists who told me they would never, ever do telemed, and now they're having to do telemed. And so, so with that, going forward, we may actually be able to have better services through telemed. But interestingly, when you try to contract telemed, in many cases, it costs more than actually having a live body. I guess they know they got you over a barrel.
I'm keeping my eye on the clock, and if both of you are able to stay, perhaps we can open it up once we hear from Dr. Konkar. We can open it up to everyone's questions, if that's okay. Are you able to stay, or?
I've got a hard stop around 1:30.
Okay. Well, let me ask the group this. Are there any other questions that anyone would really like to address to Mr. Covington or Mr. LeBlanc?
I have a question. This is Rachel with LaFasa. My question was, whenever you were talking about how someone is assigned a number based on the level of severity of their mental health issues or how much care that they would need at first, how often is that reevaluated? Is that something that would be reevaluated every time a physician sees the person? Or is that something that is a number that's set in stone? Because I can imagine if you have pre-existing trauma, when you enter prison, once you have been in prison for a while, that trauma is going to be compounded and you're going to have a lot more triggers just because of the nature of incarceration itself,
I would say no. Okay, so first to answer the first question, we do evaluate that frequently. I mean, we're probably more quick to drop that number, which meaning put them in a more acute state when we see them struggling, than we are to increase that number. Formally, we review it annually, but at any point during the year or during the course of treatment, we can change that number at will. The lower numbers tend to change a lot because the more acute SMIs tend to get a little bit better and get a little bit worse, and so they shuffle a little bit more. The level of care 5s don't shuffle that much. And as far as for the trauma within incarceration, I would say that I wouldn't make the assumption that everybody who goes into incarceration is going to experience trauma. But okay, to your point, yeah, that number is going to change time and time.
I actually still have a number of questions, and I imagine a lot of folks do, but I do have to keep an eye on the clock. So what I'm going to propose, if it's okay with Assistant Secretary Covington and Director LeBlanc, if we gather the questions that the task force members may have, and we can forward them to you by email, and perhaps you can give us answers that we can then share and distribute, if that's okay.
Yeah, we'd be happy to.
Well, thank you so much. And again, if you're able to stay, great. I understand that you do have a deadline to address too, but I wanted to make sure we have enough time also to hear from Dr. Konkar and then the other business as well. So if I don't have a chance later, before you have to leave, thank you so much for your time and energy in helping this task force understand the scope of the problem. And I will tell you, the one thing I will certainly be asking is if you could have what's your wish list? And, you know, what three big changes might, you know, do you think would be helpful to see? And that this perhaps this task force could be thinking about recommending. So that would, of course, be, I think, a very helpful thing for us to know as well. So again, thank you so much. I'd like to turn over to Dr. Konkar. Dr. Konkar is a sociology professor, chairman of the sociology department at Loyola University. His area of specialty is criminology with specific focus on incarceration of survivors, and has done a lot of work with intimate partner survivors who are incarcerated as well, both in men's facilities and the women's facilities, and has done a lot of project and work with Department of Corrections. So Dr. Konkar, thank you so much for joining us. And again, as I set the tone before you, actually, we are hoping you'll be able to share with the task force sort of the scope of the problem and what you can explain about how folks, you know, intimate partner survivors as well as trauma survivors, how that's a pathway to incarceration. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, and I apologize for being late. I was in another Zoom call until Becky, my spouse, was saying, where are you? You're supposed to be there. I had it down for 1 o'clock. Anyway, so I'm happy to catch up with you and be here. You know, my understanding is that there are various degrees of expertise and experience with these issues on this task force, and including folks who have direct contact with clients. And that just completely changes one's understanding of these things. And so I expect many of you know a great deal about this from a direct client services perspective than I do. And I apologize in advance if some of this may seem very basic. I promise not to talk about the power and control wheel. But I come to this as a researcher and someone who does data analysis on these things from afar in my office, with the exception of a very in-depth project that I did at LCIW, recording life history interviews with about 55 women. Where you use kind of a life course criminology perspective, where you know it's not one incident that got you to prison. You look at the whole life course, and that's where you can uncover some of these less obvious, more indirect pathways where early childhood trauma, for example, informs decisions made in one's teens that then sort of sets up a sort of spiral down to prison. And so I can draw on some of that as well. But Catherine asked me to give us a sense of, you know, where does Louisiana sit in the national context? So I'll share a little bit of national data and patterns on this. We'll look at the demographics of women incarcerated in Louisiana. DOC has fantastic demographic data. They know all of the key bits of information about folks who are incarcerated, both men and women. The type of information, that type of qualitative information about experiences with trauma, of course, is much more difficult to get. And so I will also talk a little bit about how we might go about collecting that data and some of the obstacles to that. You know, one of the things, you know, well, we'll talk about it when we get to it, but one of the things to think about is whether or not we actually need to have a firm grasp on the numbers of women who have trauma and abuse in their histories, right? So it depends on what you want to do with that data. I think it's fairly safe to assume, based on national data, that the prevalence is extremely high. And then we figure out, well, where do we want to divert resources? Do we want to divert resources to identifying specifically how many of those women, or just get those women into services, or perhaps use some of that information to provide some of those women some relief and maybe a second look with respect to reform. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen with you, if I can do that.
We may have to give you permission.
It's telling me.
No. Yeah, great.
So what I'll do here, and if any of this is not particularly relevant or interesting, Catherine, please tell me just to move on. But sometimes we get very Louisiana focused, and I think it's good sometimes to see where we sit in the national context. And unlike male patterns of incarceration in Louisiana, the women's patterns of incarceration in Louisiana look very much like what's happening in the country. And we're really not an outlier, even with respect to incarceration rates for women. So I think, sometimes it's good to look at that where we are. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the national research on the prevalence of abuse among incarcerated women, the pathways research that heavily informed my project on the women at LCIW. And then I'll just discuss one case study, because so many of the women that I interviewed captured almost all of these pathways and in ways that I don't think we would ever really see if we were to quickly survey women on these issues. A lot of these things would remain invisible. And then talk a little bit about the data collection. So Catherine, does that sound like a plan? Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, Marcus, just as sort of as an FYI, we will have to keep sort of an eye on the clock, probably we have about 45 minutes maybe.
Oh yeah, I can definitely keep to that. If we look at, this is national data. If we look at national data, we see that the sort of exponential growth in women's incarceration was really from 1980 to 2000. And then there's been a growth since then, but it's not as extreme as that initial growth. Women still make up, upwards of 7% of the prison population nationally. They make up actually 4 and a bit % of Louisiana's state prison population. And as a result, they tend to be such a small piece of the pie that they are very much understudied. It's something that we need more information on, both nationally, but certainly on the state level. There's been some interesting racial and ethnic convergence patterns with this. Again, this is national data. And if you were to look at this and compare it to the slide I previously showed you here, which is looking at the overall population, your eyes can be deceptive. It might even look like the incarceration rates have been going down, and we should expect a smaller incarceration rate. But that really is deceptive, because what we're seeing is an increase in white women going to prison, and at that rate. And because Blacks only make up about 13% of the population, if we see a sharp decline in Black incarceration rates, it doesn't have as much of an effect on the overall population, if that makes sense. So I'll break this down into this, and here's where you can actually see the numbers that are represented in that previous graph. We have seen a 41% increase in the incarceration rate of white women. Of course, if we're looking at that rate and then translated as a percentage of the population of white women in the US, that's what's driving that broader trend. We actually see a massive decrease in Black women's incarceration rates. And so, this is something that is a little unusual in incarceration data, to see that kind of a pattern, because we tend to be given information that suggests that everybody's going to prison more, and it's not the case. So I just wanted to show that pattern over the last 20 years. And if we look at where Louisiana is, there is so much variation across states in terms of incarceration rates for women. 10 in 100,000 in Massachusetts to a high of 138 in Idaho for some reason. Louisiana is right where my cursor is here at 71. Again, if we were to do this for men incarcerated across states, we'd be right at the top of this list. We're not. I think, we're sort of a little higher than the national average, but not an outlier. So whatever we're doing in Louisiana with incarceration when it comes to women seems to look a little bit more of the characteristics that we see nationally, whereas you cannot say that for men. The national rate's 54, ours is 71. the kinds of offenses, again, I'll show you what it looks like for Louisiana here in a second, but you can see the differences for men and women with respect to the type of crime. I think that because states define crimes of violence so differently, it's important not to make too much of an inference about every state from this data. But we look like this. So this is the national pattern in terms of violent property, drug, and public order offenses. And this is what it looks like for Louisiana. Okay, so we have, as Rhett said earlier, about 1,200 people. That's a very small and manageable group of people, actually, when you look at the comparisons to other states. So 1,200 of the roughly 28,000 folks in state custody. So that's 4.6% of all people incarcerated in Louisiana, as opposed to that 7% national number. But I do want to draw your attention to the bottom of this slide. 64% of those 1,233 women are housed in local sheriff's facilities as opposed to state facilities. And the reason that I think that that's important is because it has all kinds of implications for resources. And so from what I gathered from what Blake was saying is that the acute cases get transferred over to state facilities because it makes sense to take them to where the resources are is more efficient than trying to bring the resources into all these various local parishes. And it makes sense that they would do it that way because of the way we are unique in the United States with respect to the percentage of state prisoners that are housed in these local facilities. And there's not a single state that comes anywhere close to it. And of course, they are very differently resourced. And when it comes to mental health services, that resource disparity becomes that much more acute. So I do think this makes us unique. But it is what we have. So we see slightly, you see, when you compare it to men, again, we don't see quite the same racial disparity. Less than half of our incarcerated female population is Black, as opposed to the over two thirds of our male population. But we do have that very high sort of drug group, but that's reflective of the national data on that as well. Average sentences for women are less than men. And in fact, DOC data on the female population has even more data than I'm presenting here. They have quite a lot of detail, like age of admission and all kinds of other things that some of you may find interesting. And it's all publicly available. I've had so much cooperation every time I do a data request from them. Melanie Guejo and the folks on her team, I mean, they have fantastic data that have been very useful to me. But okay, so I want to move on and get to the trauma studies. So one of the problems with getting a sense of the prevalence of abuse among incarcerated women is that there's a lot of variation among those studies. So some time ago, I did sort of like a meta-analysis of those studies. That is, you look at all the studies and you see what they have in common and what kinds of patterns that they show. And what you see is that some of those studies focus on childhood trauma. Some of them only focus on trauma experienced as adults. Some of them only focus on domestic violence. Some of them only focus on sexual abuse. And as a result, you get all these very different estimates of what's going on. So the sampling biases and also the different sources of those traumatic experiences vary. And I think that's my conclusion, was that that's what's driving what appears to be very inconsistent portraits of women in prison. The larger government-sponsored studies by the Department of Justice and National Institutes of Justice their estimates tend to be lower. And that's usually because they use a survey approach to gathering that kind of data, where very often they are dependent on labels rather than getting questions that are behaviorally specific, which is likely to actually uncover much more, a higher prevalence when we use behaviorally specific language, as opposed to have you ever been X, Y, and Z. In-depth studies of smaller samples that use appropriate language tends to show estimates as high as 90% in some cases, which again, I think for those of you who work directly with clients would not be surprised to see. In the life history project that I did at LCIW, severe traumatic pasts were present in about half of the women, but I should add that I wasn't trying to screen for trauma. I was doing a general life history interview for women who were either serving life sentences or otherwise very lengthy sentences. Almost all of the women that I talked to were convicted of murder or manslaughter. And I was not trying to find a sample who would be representative of the population of women incarcerated in Louisiana, right? So clearly I'm looking at folks who were convicted for more serious offenses, serving very long times. And there's no reason to think that they would have more or less trauma in their lives. I wasn't doing that. So we would have to be a slightly different study, and I can talk about some ideas for that at the end. So I think that any of you who have worked with women who are incarcerated will see, there are some very clear direct paths. And I think the research community is actually quite good at recognizing direct paths, the most direct path being fighting back. That is when a woman fights back in response to what is a criminally criminally actionable offense, and our legal protections fail in that regard, and then we see people going to prison. So when we have people responding to intimate partner violence who are then held to a self-defense standard that's been developed really for men in the context of protecting their homes and dueling and so forth. Those of you on the task force who are attorneys, I'm sure can speak much more to this, but when we apply the standard of self-defense using issues of proportionality, imminence of harm, and the reasonableness of the response in the context of intimate partner violence, it's just not very helpful to those women. And so we see many women who, for example, equalize the proportionality with, say, a knife and a single stab wound, which seems, is very reasonable from the standpoint of the person who's in that situation and who has a different understanding of imminence. When we use those standards, those women tend to end up in prison. I know that Catherine and Becky, through their experience with the Women's Prison Project at Tulane Law School, it's just running into women who fit this profile over and over and over again. So we're good at recognizing those. We're pretty good at recognizing very direct forms of duress where people are coerced into criminality. What we're less good at recognizing is the ways in which women get tied up and entangled with men committing offenses and then get charged as principals. Close to half of the women that I talked to at LCIW were convicted as principals to an offense where the primary person was usually a man. And so, if you were to Google principles in the context of law, in most places that means the so-called trigger man, right? It means the primary actor. But in Louisiana, it means accomplice. And of course, we don't make a distinction between those who are the primary actors and those who are principals. If you're in somehow related to the offense, you are held to the same standard. And then also, I think another thing that we fail to recognize is that the more subtle forms of coercion. So we recognize duress as a legal standard, but in a very explicit way, as opposed to from the perspective of Evan Stark's concept of coercive control, which refers to lots and lots of small ways of controlling and constraining women, such that any particular decision or any particular action might on its face not look coerced, but in the context of long-standing and different intertwining patterns of control, very much are. And so that's a part where, again, our legal system tends to fail women because they fail to recognize those patterns. We tend to look at events and specific actions right before an act in order to create some kind of causal inference between those things, as opposed to looking at the long-term patterns of control. And then, of course, entrapment, sort of retaliatory arrests, very often people who are very adept at perpetrating intimate partner violence get very good at working the system, making proactive calls to the police, getting restraining orders out on their victims and so forth. So, and that's not necessarily something that sends those women into prison, but it creates the beginning of a spiral, either a criminal history or some other type of limitation on a woman's ability to stay out of the criminal justice system. The indirect pathways, I found this to be so emblematic of the women that I interviewed at LCIW. It's the kind of criminality that starts out of economic desperation because of some situation that a woman finds herself, usually as a teenager, based on some kind of childhood trauma. So when women are again, we know that intimate partner violence is the leading cause of homelessness, where whatever criminal activity women may be engaged in is that much more visible and is subject to policing, which creates, again, a sort of spiral of involvement with the criminal justice system. Drug sales and sex work out of economic desperation is, again, another pathway that we don't immediately tie to trauma and abuse, but very often when we start to say, okay, well, how did you end up in this situation? What got you into that particular place? And the underlying cause is usually some kind of traumatic and abusive event earlier. And then there's criminality as a coping mechanism, right? Which is really medicating trauma that has been undetected in various other settings. That type of drug use that then, again, all of these things I think are sort of like catalysts for further involvement with abusive men, really. And then criminality to support that addiction sets off this cycle, right? So you have a person who's traumatized, let's say from childhood, runs away, goes, is dealing with economic desperation of various kinds, gets into possible sex work or drug sales, and then starts medicating with that, and then needs to engage in criminal activity to continue to medicate the trauma. And it's just a spiral from there. I'm gonna, in order to illustrate this, I think it's useful to look at a specific case. But before I do that, I just want to, again, point out that when we look at the ways in which trauma and abuse intersects with women's lives that then send them to prison, it's not all women equally affected by this. So women of color, as Becky tells me over and over again, who are underprotected but over-policed, are particularly vulnerable to these situations. They're also particularly, there's some reluctance to get their abusers involved with the criminal justice system for all kinds of complicated reasons. Immigrants, both documented and undocumented, are particularly vulnerable also to this. and of course, women in poverty and women with criminal histories. So I want to share just a few details around somebody that I don't really want to identify by name, but who really sort of captures all of these problems. The vast majority of these things would never be apparent if you were to read a transcript of a trial, or if you were to look at a direct appeals document for the facts of a case. Most of that trauma, most of this woman's life history is rendered completely invisible by that sort of statement of the facts. And again, I think if you were to take a survey approach to this, you would be very unlikely to uncover these things. So this is a woman at LCIW. She grew up in St. Bernard Parish. She was in a single parent household with a fairly dysfunctional mother. And from a very early age, she started to experience sexual abuse, first from family members, but then mostly from the men who came into her mother's life. She told me this terrible story about cutting a hole in the sheetrock of her room and covering it with a piece of wood so that she could escape into her brother's room when she was 8 years old, as a way of getting away from the men who would come into her mother's life. These same men would also give her alcohol and pills, and she described herself as a pillhead at the age of 11. So you have this very traumatic early childhood experience, and then it starts to express itself in ways that make perfect sense to somebody who understands the way trauma manifests. But if you don't have that understanding, all it looks like is a kid in constant trouble, getting in constant trouble. So acting out, fighting in school, fighting at home, began fighting physically with her mother for failing to protect her, and all of those complicated emotions going on. Eventually running away, dropping out of school, engaging in various acts of self-harm that put her into, that raised the attention of medical care providers, who failed to recognize the underlying sources of the trauma, and again, treated her as a disciplinary problem. So she began medicating problems because she failed to get that kind of intervention from mental health services, which she did seek out and received, but they just didn't, they weren't treating trauma, they treated a troubled kid. And she ends up becoming addicted to drugs. And she's working at various fast food restaurants, trying to make a go of it. She's clearly still has all these underlying issues. And then, and it's always then, and then I met this guy, that's this punctuating part of the story. And then I met this guy, and it's usually an older man. In this case, it was a man who was 7 years older than her. She meets at the age of 15. That relationship quickly becomes extremely violent, with weapons being held at her head and so forth. And that person is engaged in various crimes of his own, and starts to pull her into those offenses. It starts off with petty theft, car break-ins, and eventually leads to burglaries. The last of which resulted in the murder of the homeowner, who was not supposed to be there, while this woman was actually in the car in the driveway when the murder took place. She was held to the principal standard at the age of 18 and was held responsible for the murder of that homeowner. They're both serving the exact same sentence. So again, to me, it was such a clear and recognizable path. All of the ways in which both the mental health, the schools, any kind of family services, juvenile justice processes that could have intervened, all of that failed her. And then our legal system failed her again for not even raising any of these issues in her case. And there she is. And I think that she did avail herself of some of the programs that Rhett and Blake mentioned that are in the prisons that tend to be run by other incarcerated folks, and is still, working through some of those issues, but really should never have gotten there in the first place. Screening. So again, I don't want to go on for too much longer, but when Catherine was telling me about this, the task force charge, I immediately started thinking, like, on how on earth are we going to go about the task of actually identifying these folks? There are screening challenges for trauma for the general population generally, but it's particularly acute for folks who are involved with the criminal justice system. I've been working with some folks in reentry to develop some basic screening tools that can be administered, either self-administered or administered by a case manager very easily and quickly. They are tried and true instruments that have been validated across different populations for anxiety, depression, and PTSD. But I think those same instruments would be very difficult when you're in the intake process, right? So there are, at that time, major issues with confidentiality, with trust, with the person wanting to open up. It's certainly going to be that much more difficult if it were DOC staff who were trying to collect that information from somebody at intake. Somebody, for example, who works for DOC in classification, when they're trying to figure out, like, what's going on with this person, where do we put them? That orientation is really about future risk. So we do have, obviously all corrections facilities must follow the PREA standards, Prison Rape Elimination Act standards. And one of the pieces of information that we're required to collect is a history of victimization or a history of perpetration. But that information by itself isn't particularly useful. What it is, it's designed to make the prison experience in the future safer. It's not designed to address any past harm that has been done. And it wasn't supposed to do that. So it's supposed to do what it's supposed to do, and it's doing that, but it's not particularly helpful to the work of this task force. So I mentioned this at the beginning, and these are just some ideas that I've had just through thinking it through, and mainly because I've spent so much time in the prison environment, and I feel like I have a fairly good sense of the culture and the tendency to want to protect one's privacy. I think it would be very difficult for the Department of Corrections to do this internally, actually. So one approach could be, there are very few situations where you have a lot of intimate partner violence, abuse, or childhood sexual abuse and childhood physical abuse that will not create some kind of trauma. So perhaps it matters less what the source of the trauma is, and maybe the idea is just like, let's just identify folks who are dealing with trauma, regardless of whether it's intimate partner violence related or not, and get them help. So if your goal is just to get women who are dealing with trauma services, you don't really need to go into their life history. You just give them some basic screenings, and that, again, administered by somebody other than DOC, and you protect their confidentiality. So it would not be part of their medical record. It would be an external process. And then the second option is to do some kind of internal review board approved study, usually by a university or a research representative service organization, where you go in with a clear understanding that you can communicate to people in the study that this is completely confidential, and that none of the information will be used to individually identify anybody, and no individually identifying information would be shared with DOC. I actually found that while I was not going in there to talk about trauma per se, I found that once I had explained the project and explained the goals of what I was doing and shared with them the informed consent forms, the personal appearance release forms, I found I was shocked at how candid people were with me. And you have to do it without DOC staff in the room, right? I think that an IRB approved study with all kinds of confidentiality protections in place would allow you to get a sample of the 1,200 or so women that you stratify. You stratify for time served, you stratify for age at admission, you stratify for whether they're staying in a local facility or a state facility. You get a representative sample and you do some in-depth questions. And that really will, I think, lead to a much more accurate sense of what we're dealing with. If it's important for you to check the assumption that we can just assume there's a lot of trauma in this population, right? If it's important to get to know exactly how much, then you would have to do it this way. But I think any kind of tool that would be from within the Department of Corrections is unlikely to get us very much useful information at all. And then we'll be in the business of trying to estimate underreporting. So I should probably keep quiet. I'm happy to answer questions, but
Well,
share it with the group.
that was, I mean, thank you so much. That was an incredible amount of information and trying to process it. But I think it was incredibly helpful, and particularly your suggestions at the end, I think also are very helpful. I'd like to open it up to the group if there's anyone who has a question of Dr. Konkar.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks so much for that presentation. This is just sort of an echo of the question that Rachel asked folks from DOC, but I don't know if this was part of your conversations in the interviews or the research you did, but can you speak at all to what you found as a researcher of people who had previous trauma and are now incarcerated, considering the ways that incarceration compounds trauma? Was that part of your study,
Yeah.
or did any of your subjects speak to the way that the incarceration environment compounded their trauma?
Yeah, so a lot of them did. My project wasn't really trying to uncover sources of trauma or traumatic events, but I think that the overall pattern was that they were very traumatized in the parish jail, awaiting trial. That they often look back on that time as being the most traumatic. And then actually, because I was doing this study at LCIW, which is a very which you know, I did this after St. Gabriel flooded, but all of the women that I talked to, their entry point into the state system was at St. Gabriel, which couldn't be more different than a parish jail, or even the types of local facilities that we had. So they actually described coming to LCIW as a relief from the trauma of the parish jails. But they do talk about the first few months, and in some cases, a couple of years, as being very traumatizing at LCIW. And then everything from there starts to improve. And I think, and again, I'm not a medical or mental health professional. I'm not trained to try to sort of screen for any of these kinds of issues. But my overall impression as a layperson, and based on their own reports of things, is that they started to address some of that underlying trauma through the programs that were actually run by other incarcerated people. So for example, so many of the folks, the survivors of domestic violence, who then go through the domestic violence training at LCIW, all of a sudden, all of these things start to make sense. And they realize that, no, it wasn't me. There was nothing wrong with me. I was actually being very normal. I was having a normal response to an abnormal situation. And those kinds of insights that come from those groups that they run, they talk about that as being some of the most valuable things in their path to kind of getting better. But you know, that's also dependent on that person's willingness to open up, to want to share, to develop enough trust in order to and confidence in another person in order to divulge these types of details, which takes a while. In some cases, it took years before some of those women in my project would trust enough to speak in a public setting. So, you know, we talked a little bit about the limitations of group therapy earlier, that would be a barrier. You know, and I don't know. I think that I'm not sure if that's more or less for women. It seems to me that the sort of that sort of shutting down hard exterior culture of prison in general is more pronounced in the men that I interviewed. I interviewed 150 men about their life histories, but again, not looking for the abuse things. But I do think that the programs that are in the prisons really help these women, but they're run by other incarcerated people. And I think having an externally imposed model as a group therapy model probably wouldn't be. You know, it's all about trust, is what I was saying.
Can I, Marcus, I have a couple questions sort of along those lines. One question is, you mentioned how traumatizing their initial incarceration was in the parish jail. Can you identify, or did they offer, or could you detect what specifically about that experience? What were the qualities that made that parish time so traumatizing?
Yeah, you know, so gosh, so many talked about this idea of being so living in fear the whole time in the context of an abuser, and then thinking that once the police intervene, that finally they're safe, and then being put into the parish and feeling that they have to start fighting everybody in there as well. Like there's no place to feel safe. And I think also that just the trauma of going through a trial, because that's when that's all unfolding. And also, you know, again, like really the pattern is just horrible legal representation during that process, feeling kind of abandoned, like you're lost. I mean, you know, those patterns came up over and over again. I think also not knowing, not being in control of anything at that time. So most of the women that I talked to found the parish jail experience while they were awaiting a trial or being offered a plea arrangement of some kind, negotiating all of that in a very hostile environment, mixed in with folks in the jail population, which is sort of a revolving door. Most talked about that as the worst part of it. I mean, and you know, the men at Angola talked that the one place that they would, the last place on earth to this day they would rather be is an OPP. So you know, I think there are just characteristics of jails that make them particularly dangerous and traumatic places.
And sort of as you said, can you talk a little bit? I know you've done you've done a lot of interviews with the men. Can you, and obviously, as you mentioned before, the purpose of your interviews wasn't to uncover trauma, but are there any sort of findings? Because this task force does have, you know, a specific mandate to be looking at issues related to victims of intimate partner violence, but also trauma broadly. And so I assume you also found trauma among the male population too, as pathway.
Is the charge of the task force to also examine the role that trauma plays in men's paths?
Well, just trauma across the board with specific focus on how it affects women too.
Yeah,
But,
sure.
but certainly how trauma has an impact on all sort of the criminal intersections between different populations.
Yeah, and again, I think it's important to preface this that I'm not a mental health, as you know, Catherine, I'm not a mental health professional, and I don't want to claim some kind of expertise on how trauma even works. But I can just go on what I get told. There are these sort of common themes that emerge out of the narratives. And it's very different for men and women, actually. So men tend not to have the sexual trauma, the past of sexual abuse. It did come up among the men, but it was rare. It was much, much more common. I would say almost to the point of being the norm among women. And that childhood and that sexual trauma being way back early in their lives, right? And I think that for me, with the women, so often that becomes the sort of catalyst for other behaviors that then create so many problems in girls' lives as teens. And you don't see the same connection with boys, but you do see the trauma of fighting, especially boys who were involved with the juvenile system. They refer to them as gladiator schools, right? Where corrections officers would either turn a blind eye to fights or create an avenue for them. You go into that room and sort it out. The guys that I talked to who had any time at LTI talk about fighting every single day. So I think that kind of, which is traumatic too. I think also the physical violence of men's facilities, especially jails and juvenile facilities, creates a different type of trauma that, women at LCIW don't talk about fighting every day. There are other problems, but I do think they're very different. I think a lot of the trauma that men experience as kids has to do with street violence, as opposed to family violence. Now, I don't want to make a broad generalization. So very often when this is why it's so important to ask behaviorally specific questions. So rather than asking, was there any sexual abuse or child abuse in your childhood? Did you experience it? They would never characterize it that way. But then I would always ask questions about, well, so how would discipline work in your family? Who was the disciplinarian, and how would that discipline actually manifest itself? And all of a sudden, this same person who told me that they had no child abuse in their history is telling me about electrical cords and all kinds of horrific things that by today's standards would be considered child abuse by anybody. And so you do see similar rates of physical abuse, but you don't have the sexual abuse as much. Now, I should also say that men may be less likely to divulge sexual abuse. So I don't have, but I felt fairly, these life history interviews are incredibly intimate and intense. And there is a sort of, I almost found myself sort of having a great deal of respect for the space that you're in when you're doing those kinds of life history interviews. I've never sat across from somebody and told them my life story. I would find it a little overwhelming, and it is. But the upside of that is that they're very, very candid, right? It's a safe space. So I had men who told me that and I never intended this or wanted it to be, that it was the most therapeutic experience that they've ever had. That why would anybody want to know about this, that, and the other? And I haven't talked about my childhood for 25 years, or, these kinds of things. And I think there are some similar experiences with the women, but as a result, I feel fairly confident that I did capture an accurate piece. It was not, the information was not being used for any purpose other than to learn about them as human beings. And I think that's a different space to be able to talk about these things than being screened by a corrections officer.
Sure.
So,
And also, I'm sure the time you put into it too showed a certain amount of respect and
yes,
story.
yes.
Are there any other questions from different taskmasters?
Hi, this is Dolphinette. I don't have a question. I just would really like to thank Dr. Condor.
I'm Marcus. You can just call me Marcus.
Marcus. Thank you. I myself, a survivor, formerly incarcerated woman, I have never seen a presentation that was so accurately presented. And this is why we, those of us who are formerly incarcerated, do this work, so that our voices and our words are spoken. And you did just that. And I thank you for all of us who you took the time to hear. It triggered some things for me because you shared, like, the story, the one story you shared isn't just that one person's story. And I am honored that you were the one to share it.
Well, thank you. That means a great deal to me. Thank you. The fact of the matter is that I honestly, and I don't say this with some like false humility, but it's their stories, right? I'm kind of a vehicle for it. It's their words. It's not my experience. And they are the most powerful. That's the most powerful way to come into an understanding of these things is through those experiences. Let them speak for themselves instead of us imposing our interpretation of those things. And that's what the project is all about. So if it wasn't for their stories and their courage to tell them, we would really not have much, I wouldn't have much of a sense of what's going on.
There was one thing I wrote down though, and I'll stop, that you said was the women became, they talked about the parish jail and that trauma. And as someone who was in the parish jail, that fear of the abuse that's received from sheriff's deputies, no one sees it. It's like its own silo. And who do you report it to? You report it to the people that's abusing you, right? But then when you make it over to the state prison, there's people that can see it. So you kind of get a sense of, well, if it happens, someone else can see it and then report it. Whether it goes somewhere or not, it's just the feeling of a little bit safer over here than over here. But because of the people who are running those programs, us, we trust us. Because when you told our story just now, you talked about the mom didn't protect us, the dad didn't protect us, the family didn't protect us. All of the people that's supposed to protect us did not. And we have that commonality. So we trust each other to protect our traumas.
Absolutely, yeah. It's so much more complicated than a first glance would tell you. And the data by itself doesn't capture that human lived experience that I think is so important to get to, yeah. Well,
Well,
thank you.
I think listening both Marcus to you and to Dolphinette, one of the themes that strikes me is that when thinking about programming is that it really, what we need is we need to be training perhaps or encouraging or setting the space to be available for the incarcerated people to be starting and running and organizing some of the programming. It sounds like that's both Marcus, what you're saying, and Dolphinette also what you're saying. So that should be the kind of programming maybe we as a task force need to be thinking about models for that kind of assistance to encourage that kind of programming.
I would agree with that, especially for programs that wouldn't require training and sort of formal training in counseling.
Licenses, certifications, yeah.
Right. I think my experience is that nobody can help an incarcerated person more than another incarcerated person with some of these things. Now, there may be exceptions when you have to have very high levels of training. And again, that's sort of beyond my expertise.
Are there any other questions? Again, I'm like the watch keeper, keeping time on the time. So does anyone else have any other questions for Dr. Conca?
I have a comment and on the same note of what we were just talking about. But, in leading groups, I had multiple women disclose to me that in the parish jails, that's where they were sexually assaulted by other residents of the jail, and that was a very routine thing. And I think that, in those facilities, things get really overcrowded for whatever reason. I don't know if it's just tolerated or if people aren't able to look out, if it's staffing issues or whatever the case is. But that is a very common thing that I've heard, women crawling into bed with other inmates that they're not in a relationship with. It was not a consensual arrangement at all, so that certainly can compound trauma, especially when you've most likely been the survivor of assault prior to being there, and on top of like the stress of the trial and whatever else may be, all the uncertainty.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, certainly a lot of challenges. Any other questions? Well, Marcus, thank you so much for coming. I have to echo with Dolphinette's comments that I think it was incredibly powerful and very helpful for us to hear this information, both the story, also the statistics as well. And we may ask if we can gather some of those PowerPoint to sort of incorporate into our report. If you're comfortable with that, that could be very helpful.
Of course, yeah.
And thank you so much for the time and energy you put into making that presentation and for sharing it with us. Again, I think it was incredibly valuable for us to hear and really sort of orients the whole discussion. So again, thank you very much.
Sure, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I think that all of this is going to be very useful if for the task members, particularly for the first three mandates of our three tasks in the resolution, which asks us to focus on what data is available, what kinds of things we might be asking DOC to be doing to collect trauma. I think we can take the information that we got today to help us sort of devise at least some proposals and plans. I know Katie's been collecting all of this, that we'll work together to sort of put in a cohesive format and then share with the group for comments and suggestions. I do know that from our last meeting for item number 4 on our agenda, discussion of the task force directives, we had a number of folks who were going to go out and reach out and get some information. I didn't know if anyone here today was prepared to report back. I also know Katie has been collecting some information that folks have offered. I received some information from Francis, and I know we had some other information that came back to us. Is anyone, I see Paola has their hand raised. I don't know, I'm looking on my, is that hand a real hand or just a, okay, maybe it was just an incident. Oh, actually, that's not. All right, I apologize. I think that was somehow it was my cursor. But does anyone have anything that they would like to report back in terms of data that they were asked to go or volunteered to go get? And if not, maybe Katie, do you want to sort of give us a summary report of what we've gathered?
I sent some stuff to Katie, so I don't know if she would prefer, or they would prefer to discuss that. But I sent some emails to some of my contacts at LCIW, and then another email to the PREA coordinator at Louisiana DOC. Mostly because I think the presentation we just watched, there was a really good point that, you know, PREA is designed to prevent future assault. But in preventing future assault, you know, one of the risk factors of future assault is if you've been victimized prior. So for that reason, I was just curious about, you know, what data might be available from the PREA intake. So I asked, this is from LCIW first. I said at LCIW, what questions are on the PREA intake? And the response was, are you a victim of prison rape or sexual assault? Is there a physical disability or a developmental disability? Is there a mental disability? Is there a history of past sexual abuse? Is this the first incarceration? Are you or do others perceive you to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, or gender nonconforming? Because it's also a risk factor. Do you consider yourself vulnerable to sexual assault? Are you under the age of 18? Are you age 65 or older? Do you have a slight or small physical stature? Detained solely for civil immigration purposes, has an exclusively nonviolent criminal history, has a previous conviction of sex offense against an adult or a child.
Yeah, actually, Rachel, I can share with you because I know Francis also shared the form. I'm just going to put that on share screen.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so that this is the same information you were given, right?
Yes, yeah. And the response from DOC was citing the particular PREA standard 115.41, in which they also lay out the questions. And I was also curious if maybe they had something where, you know, for their own purposes, they would go and ask more specific questions. And so I asked of LCIW, part of the PREA screening process is assessing who has been sexually victimized prior. What percentage in your best estimate identify as survivors? And the response was approximately 75%. But that's not from a formal study, that's just in their professional experience.
So that aligns with what Dr. Konkar was talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Does LCIW have their own pre-existing trauma screening that you ask in order to assess the needs of your population? What percentage of your population in your best estimate identifies as having experienced sexual abuse, domestic violence, dating violence, childhood trauma, or physical abuse prior to their entry in LCIW? Responses at intake, the offenders are asked whether they have been sexually abused and by whom. They are also asked about being in an abusive or battering relationship, past or current. Approximately 75% of the population has experienced some form of abuse prior to their entry in LCIW. And then about data storage, I asked, is this data kept in residence files or in a large database or other? How is the data stored? Are there any formal or informal logs linking trauma and incarceration that you have at your facility? The hard copy is kept in the offender's file and the information is inputted into a DOC database. We don't have any logs linking trauma and incarceration. So as far as what the PREA coordinator at DOC, who does all PREA, but the men's facilities are pretty different in a lot of ways. But I was curious what the experience would be over there. So she cites the screening tool that you just showed us. That's also in the standards. Part of the PREA screening process is assessing who's been sexually victimized prior. So when I asked about what percentage was the best estimate, Warden Dozat stated that was difficult to determine. Like she didn't even have a personal observation that she felt comfortable sharing on that. And she would be familiar with mostly the men's facilities. Does Louisiana DOC have their own pre-existing trauma screening? She says our PREA screening serves as our questionnaire for pre-existing and sexual trauma screening in addition to the battery of psychological tests completed at the reception unit. And she also stated again that it was difficult to determine what percentage. And as far as data storage, she states the data is kept in a confidential offender record and electronically. Information is stored electronically and an offender record with limited viewing privileges. And they do not currently have any logs linking trauma and incarceration.
So maybe I'm wondering if one of the questions we need to send to Director LeBlanc is how they get the information about who from that, or if they get that information about to Q who might need in particular special services.
Right.
We can list that. I don't know, Francis, do you know that answer to that?
Well, in my experiences, specifically with just the all male institutions, but at the intake board, it's a multidisciplinary board with all these various departments, security, classification, mental health, medical, all present. You know, all kind of looking at this file together and making determinations for housing placements and things of that nature. So some of that, you know, everybody has access to that information and is probably making notes and flagging individuals who may need counseling or specific services and things of that nature. But you know, and again, my experience is specific to Louisiana State Penitentiary.
And so that would happen though before someone was designated to be sent to a parish facility or not?
No, you're talking more at HRDC at the Hunt Reception and Diagnostic Center. If I had to guess, that multidisciplinary board is very similar there. So I could see that where a red flag would come up, somebody, you know, these different departments would be communicating there at Hunt, and I believe Raymond LaBorde Correctional Center serves as a diagnostic center as well.
Thank you. Anyone else have any more to report back from? I will share that I did reach out to LCCR, that's the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, just to talk about whether or not they're provider of legal services and so forth for juveniles who are in the juvenile legal system, and they do not have and are not aware of any data that's collected either through them or through the system itself about trauma. Certainly they, you know, and I think that this is true across the board for defense legal providers, is that it is not, there's certainly no collection of it globally. Whether or not an individual defense lawyer might try to investigate or ask questions of a client to unpack whether that client has been the victim of trauma is probably very limited. But it's certainly, there's no universal system for doing that. And LCCR's, again, their response was exactly that, they don't have any data on that. They're not aware of any in the juvenile system. Katie, did you have other responses that you wanted to share?
Yeah, so thank you, Diana. Star shared that they were checking on how far back their data goes, and they have data from 2020, 2021 of current clients, but not any data on incarcerated folks. I asked the Orleans Parish DA for their fatality review, which they're doing with the health department and law enforcement, but that data is not public. So I have to reach out to the health department and see, what if any of it can be shared publicly, but currently that's not available. The other action items we had that I haven't received anything on, I don't know if folks can speak to it or if they need some more time. Reps from the Louisiana District Attorney Association were checking on the prevalence of repeated victimization and what tech, if any, existed on centralized data. The Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence was checking on formerly incarcerated clients with agencies. Yeah, and then there was this note about, Francis, in addition to the DOC data, checking about cross-referencing felony supervision charges. I don't know if that is something that's actually available or that's just something we were hoping was available. So yeah, if anyone has updates on those action items or needs more time, we'd love to know.
So I'd like to encourage task members to, shoot Katie and myself and my co-chair, Leslie Chambers, who actually I know wasn't able to make most of this meeting. Shoot us an email with any information that you have. Also, please do, if a question occurs to you that you think we need to pose to one of our speakers today or other members, please also share that by email too, so that we can try to cultivate as much relevant information to answer folks' questions. I really encourage you all to do that as well. So then I would like to turn to item on our agenda number 5. This is a call for public testimony. Anyone in our audience who would like to comment about what you've heard or any of the task force's business. This is an opportunity for us to hear from members of the public who may be joining us today. Okay, I'm not hearing any spontaneous contributions, so we will, again, any members of the public are welcome to reach out to us with any questions or thoughts that they have as well. Turning then to agenda item number 6, other business. So folks, our next meeting is set for November 16th. And we were talking about some speakers for that. I think consistent with what tasks are before the task force to answer in our report, I think the next big hunk of that is going to be focused on what are some of the legal barriers to providing relief for incarcerated survivors, what are the legal hurdles that are involved, both in terms of providing relief after conviction, but also that are interfering with the ability to recognize and fairly address those issues earlier on in the criminal legal process. I certainly think, I'm with the Women's Prison Project. We represent incarcerated survivors or people also who are charged with crimes who are intimate partner violence survivors. And so the attorneys that we work with here really have firsthand knowledge on where the barriers lie. So I'd like to see if we can arrange for someone from Women's Prison Project to come speak to the group about those legal barriers and legal issues. I know Dr. Konkar touched actually on a couple of them, specifically on self-defense and how self-defense, which is modeled on a male a male conceptualization of self-defense and doesn't reflect the experience of intimate partner violence survivors is certainly one of the issues that we'd want to sort of unpack a little bit. So, but I do need to check in with our speakers to see about who's going to be available on that on November 16th date. And the other speaker that I think would be helpful for us is maybe to have someone, an assistant district attorney who also has worked on some of these cases. And we have a couple names in mind of folks who I certainly know have worked on these kinds of issues as well. But I'm certainly just, do the task force members have anyone else that they want to suggest as to come to speak at one of our few remaining meetings? We're certainly open to suggestions and recommendations. Sandra.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, you undid your microphone, so I thought maybe you were gonna, did you wanna?
No.
Okay.
I will say that I talked to Miss Deputy Warden Burks, and I talked with Miss Cyprian, Bretnika. Miss Burks wants to join. Well, she wants to come on. I don't know what does she want to be a speaker, but I can
Okay,
ask.
I can, yeah, I'm sorry.
But Miss Cyprian is no longer there, so, but she still wanted to be a speaker, so I will reach back out and see if they still want to and let you know, or let Katie know.
Right.
Yeah,
that would be-
Sandra, yeah, if you want to connect us and we can work out some of the logistics, and I can check with them if they want the Zoom info to attend and just give a comment, or if they had more, they want
Okay.
that'd be great.
Okay.
And I can certainly, I have an ongoing relationship with Assistant Warden Burks and I'm happy to reach out to her as well. That's a great, yeah, I'm glad to hear that, Sandra. Anyone else that you can think of from within? Any other folks have suggestions or people they'd like to hear from?
I'll say too, in terms of timing and for folks thinking through the timeline, we will have to have a December meeting since our September meeting was canceled because of Hurricane Ida. And the hope at that meeting will be to finalize our report, which is due in January. If we needed to, we could do more discussion at a December meeting and finalize a report in early January. But I think we all would feel better if we had some solid foundation moving into the new year rather than those first very hectic weeks of January. So if stuff comes up for people that is not on the next two agendas, which I'll send out, please let me know via email, and the chairs can assess how we can arrange, Catherine and Leslie as the chairs can assess how we should arrange meetings and agendas to fit everything in this timeline.
Thank you, Katie. Well, anything else? We actually, I'm feeling like I overzealously accomplished my task of making sure we were able to take care of all the business within time. I'm not sure I've ever ended anything early in my life, so I feel like this is some sort of, I'm a little anxious, like I've forgotten something. Okay.
I guess if folks, are able to spend the last 15 minutes we had planned, I would love to hear folks' thoughts on the presentations.
Yeah.
And, they don't have to necessarily be questions or anything, just kind of what folks found the most interesting or telling, as we start to draft this report, it'll be really helpful to know what appointees to this task force are taking away from it. And so we can make sure that those voices are reflected in the report.
I think it's a great idea.
I think some of my personal main takeaways was, we just kind of really discussed it, but coercive control not being considered in the legal system, because usually when a survivor might assault their abuser, it's not going to be in the same situation as, a street brawl or something, or just like fighting someone, I don't know, but it's not going to be as cut and dry. There's going to be the sense that you are in danger unless if you do this particular action. And the self-defense model is flawed. It's just not applicable. It's kind of a related topic. And then also, I personally didn't realize how much getting charged as either an accessory or a principal to a crime was a large problem. And, I've always heard in my reading or that women do get penalized greater for the same crime. So I'm wondering if maybe that's kind of where they're getting their information from, because Marcus's research showed otherwise. He specifically commented that women do not get harsher sentences than men, but I thought that they usually did. And I know there's a lot of discourse around that phenomenon to begin with, just vilifying, what's viewed as women's expression of anger, women's expression of violence, and the sexism that goes in with that. So, that's just the main takeaways I had from that presentation.
Rachel, thank you. And I see Marcus has joined us. I don't know, Marcus, since we've got time at the end here, did you want to comment at all on?
Yeah, so Rachel, am I understanding correctly that what you've understood is that women tend to be punished more severely, all things held constant, than men for similar offenses? Is that, and that I was saying something different? So I think what I was talking about is that, what it is, there's a feminist jurisprudence person, she's a sociologist as well, who describes it as equality with a vengeance. And it's treating women equally, really, and the vengeance part is when maybe they shouldn't be treated as equally severely. But in the cases where there's a principle, when that standard is used, women who really were tangentially involved or possibly coercively involved, they get the same exact harsh penalty as the primary perpetrator. Which to me is an example of the concept of equality with a vengeance, right? That the law doesn't make the distinction. And I certainly, there's lots of legal expertise on this group, and I just learn from them. But the problem is that we fail to make those very important distinctions. So not only did we fail to make the distinctions between the acts themselves, we fail to make the distinction in terms of the culpability of folks. So we don't even get to the point of coercive control, because by law, if like in that particular case, this woman wasn't even in the house, and so she's serving the same sentence as the perpetrator. So in that sense, I agree with you that women tend to suffer more severe consequences but there are also many men that I talked to who were principals themselves, serving life sentences, but they've never killed anybody.
Right.
The thing that I would say is that there's this sort of paradox of paternalism that operates sometimes, where the same paternalistic attitudes that we might use to suggest that, women can't be CEOs of this or that or the other, that same species of thinking can sometimes come to bear in ways that end up favoring some women in some situations, so that a woman couldn't have done as heinous an act or as violent or vicious an act because she's a woman, or she has children and she can't possibly deal with a lengthy sentence. But all of that paternalistic benefit disappears when women offend men. So it is which of course is where that is who women offend in very serious offenses, right? So gendered patterns of offending actually are intra-gendered for men. I mean, we know people offend people who are like them. Certainly is the case for race. But when women are offending in serious violent cases, they are offending men, right? The women who offend women are the smallest category of every possible combination. And so you have this, it's also, for me, it's a very different species of behavior. So when men are violent towards women, as you know, that is a very, very different kind of behavior than women who are responding in most cases to violent men. And yet we don't make that distinction either, right? They're both acts of violence, or they're both manslaughter, right? Whereas one is motivated by a whole different set of constructs than the other, and we just lump them all together. And so what I'm seeing is that as we start to standardize penalties across the board, women are getting caught up in that net of treating everybody equally, and we're failing to make those distinctions. And as almost every woman in this project can attest to, they had horrible legal representation. Some of them met their attorneys the day before their trials. Some of them had no understanding of their case and were simply persuaded to plea. And as you know, when you plea, you give up your right to an appeal and various other protections in place. So men are much more likely to go to trial and preserve a record for an appeal. Women who in these situations are very, very likely to plead down. So what we also have is we have disproportionately women get convicted of manslaughter as opposed to second-degree murder, but only because they've pled out to manslaughter, whereas men will take their chances at trial. And so there are so many areas where, I mean, and in some cases, the same thing can be said for men, poor men. It's a complete lack of competent legal representation right at that point where they need it most. And that, as Delphinette was saying, all right, that's the ending to a series of failures where women have been failed by whatever encounter they have with the system. The last one is their attorney. And I say that with respect to attorneys, which is that's just the way these things tend to happen. So yeah, it's equality with a vengeance. And then that vengeance is that much more vengeful if a woman commits a violent act towards a man, regardless if he's an abuser or not, right?
Right, it's just like the overvaluing of men or masculinity in our culture in general,
Yeah, and and there are also so many, we're talking about other sources of trauma. Well, one of a massive source of trauma that women experience, even though men and women biologically parent at the same rate, the loss of one's children, and then worrying about what's going to happen to those children while you're in jail. That's just an added level of trauma that it's almost unimaginable to me. So yeah.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking.
Thank you, Marcus, for coming in for that little, recall there. Any other comments about, or thoughts, reflections on what we've heard?
I would just add one little observation that in my experience, there's a tendency to be a little bit, we tend to sort of vilify the Department of Corrections when it comes to all kinds of issues around sort of providing for care for folks in custody, and across whether it's men or women. And I am seeing now, more efforts to create and promote those types of programs than ever before. I know that even the Pardon and Parole Board is interested in being educated about these things. As you know, you've done trainings for them. I think it's changed the way that they are looking at those cases. And I think that there is a genuine interest in the DOC, from what I see, to try to improve that kind of trauma-informed counseling approach in that population. I see the biggest problem with the way we have scattered these women through these local parish jails. And I don't know if that's likely to improve when the new LCIW is built. I mean, I think that they had really robust programs there before the flood. And so women, it's a particularly difficult time to be incarcerated as a woman in Louisiana right now. I mean, even the Jetson facility, I mean, it's just that there's no infrastructure to kind of sort of get these programs to take hold.
Yeah, they just don't have the spaces and
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things we heard today that certainly is striking, I mean, I certainly knew something about it, but I didn't quite understand or appreciate the numbers of how many people are being held in parish facilities. And what's also interesting, of course, is to learn that it's at least conceptually possible to bring in DOC programming into those parish facilities for for DOC people who are in the custody of DOC. And so that might be some avenue for the task force to consider in terms of what kind of recommendations we want to make, is how and what kinds of services maybe could be targeted for parish folks, as opposed to the DOC folks who may be getting at least some already.
Yeah. I mean, and another thing that we don't think about. So when you have a system where sheriff's jails they're working on a per diem per bed program, and there's an enormous amount of pressure to keep those beds filled, what you find also is this geographic dispersion of women. So a woman who might be otherwise at LCIW, sort of centrally located, where a family can visit, people, now, in a rural parish in North Louisiana, well, the traumatic effects of being then separated from visitation and then making all of that so much, I think that there are some things that could be done to try to keep people geographically closer to home, especially because we have this unique system of being able to move women throughout the whole state, rather than using that as an opportunity to then create that proximity to home and visitation. We just move them wherever there's an empty bed. So I think some thoughtfulness about placement, since we are scattering everybody, at least scatter them close to their families. That shouldn't take an enormous amount of work to do that.
Well, that's certainly something I think we can look at in terms of what recommendations the task force makes. And I see that we are at time now. And so if there's nothing more from anyone before we conclude, I think then it will be time to adjourn this meeting and look forward to seeing everyone on November 16th. So thank you. And again, Marcus, 1,000 thank yous. This has been incredibly useful and productive. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Nice to meet you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye-bye.